Okay, this should start the second lecture on Chapter 7. We're still talking about children in that pre-operational stage, uh, between around 3 and 7. But now we're going to be talking about the cognitive development instead of the physical development. So it's a little bit different. Now, one of the things that I want to go over is the fact that we use a few terms interchangeably for a lot of different things, and some of the terms we use really really badly. And these terms have kind of been disseminated out into the general public, and we use them all the time, but we don't really use them correctly. Idiot, by the way, is one of these words. Idiot is an actual term for somebody who scores a specific score on an intelligence test. Um, Moron, by the way, is another. If you get a specific score, I forget what it is, like 60 or something like that, you are a moron. And that's not an insult, it's literally a classification. Um, but that's not how it's seen in real life. And egocentrism is one of those words, and you're going to see that reading chapter 7. When it talks about the mental state of a child of this particular age, it talks about egocentrism. As a matter of fact, the egocentrism is huge. It's just an all-encompassing aspect of the child's mentality. So it really it touches almost everything that the child does, and that is because children of this age are by nature extremely egocentric. Another description would be self-centered, and that one's a little bit more layman term, but I kind of like it a little bit better. It's not as accurate, but it kind of gives the right impression because all their thoughts are centered on themselves. They literally cannot imagine what it's like to be anybody else. They cannot be considerate. It is impossible for a 3-year-old to be considerate. They don't have the neural pathways to do this. If they're doing something that we interpret as considerate, it would be like seeing the dog's tail wag and assuming it feels happy, some subjective happiness. It's just kind of a silly assumption that we make. Um, and so when you read through this chapter, keep in mind that these are very, very egocentric people, centered around themselves in terms of thought, and that this touches everything that they do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Their job is to learn. They can perceive others. First couple of stages of life, they can't even perceive others. Um, but they don't really take others into consideration when doing other things. They actually consider that other people are just like them. And this isn't something that humans completely grow out of, by the way. You will notice that in general, a big human flaw is that we all have a bit of this egocentrism that stays with us all the time. People naturally assume that others are like themselves. And so we get this kind of skewed view of the world. If you ask somebody who's a big baseball fan, for example, and say, what percentage of the population, really likes baseball? He'll probably, really highball that number. He'll say, 30, 40%, when it's probably like 10 tops. Um, honestly, you'd ask me, and I'd say, I don't know, 2%, because I don't follow sports in any way. So I don't know anybody that follows sports. I assume those people are out there. Um, but as adults, we keep this egocentrism around us, assuming that other people are like ourselves, because we surround ourselves with people that are like ourselves. Um, and so, if you follow baseball, chances are a lot of people do. And if you don't follow sports in any way, most of the people probably couldn't care less either. Um, the egocentrism, by the way, is also really important, and we'll get into this a little bit more during Wednesday's discussion when we start talking about the emotional and social development of children this age. But there are some times when this egocentrism has been overlooked, and there's been a lot of damage happening. Almost as bad or worse than all those children who went through those lobotomies that I spoke about yesterday. Um, and that is another one of those ethical problems where people weren't looking at science when they were making decisions. There was a fad, and everybody knows about it. Those dolls where you want to find out if a kid was molested, so you show them an anatomically correct doll. That's the show us where the bad man touched you doll. We all know what it is. Unfortunately, this was used for a decade or two before a psychologist started looking for the evidence. He was trying to cite it in a paper or something, and he was looking for the evidence on where they had researched it, and he was surprised that he couldn't find any. And he looked and looked and looked, and it turned out it had never been tested. And as a matter of fact, the people that thought of it, they hadn't tested it, and they weren't keeping the egocentrism of children in consideration. As a matter of fact, if you take a 4-year-old, which the dolls are typically given to people under the age of 5, 7 tops. If you give a 4-year-old a doll, and then you take a star sticker, and you put it on the kid's forehead, and then you say, okay, now you go ahead and you take this other star sticker and you put it on the doll in the same place that you have a sticker. Most of them can't do it. They physically, mentally cannot do it. They can't really, even on such a basic level, they would have to imagine that they are something else, and they can't take that other perspective. They start to develop it between 5 and 7, which is about the time where they get into the concrete operational stage instead of the pre-operational that we're talking about this week, and that's when they stop using the dolls too. Thousands of people were arrested and sent to jail for years based on this evidence that has no scientific basis whatsoever. As a matter of fact, they did find out that if you give a kid an anatomically correct doll, the first thing that kids love new things, the first thing they do is, oh, but, right, every time. They will find an orifice and put a finger in there. Why? Because they've never seen a doll with a butt before. The novelty alone makes them focus on it. Now, one thing that I did want to cover, and this is the chapter on here, I just wanted to let you know, for this chapter, especially where it's the chapter I'm splitting up into 2 days. It's not even a chapter a day. I expect you to read this word for word and read it really, really well for the tests. But there's one thing, Table 7.1, 7.1. It talks about a lot of the cognitive development that you have between the different stages of the pre-operational stage. And one of the interesting things, which is something to think about when rearing children and to decide what you should and should not be saying to these people, these tiny people, is it mentions that between the ages of 4 to 7, you start thinking logically. And you start replacing some of the fairy tale beliefs that you had, like fairies and goblins and that sort of stuff, with things that have more of a rational explanation. You know, it's not the fairies under your bed that, that took your favorite car. You probably just misplaced it. And so at this time they start to think a little bit more rational, and they can separate fantasy from reality a little bit more. And another theme you'll notice when reading this chapter is that the whole chapter is talking about tons of different things. Play, make-believe, talking to themselves, all of these things. And not just Vygotsky's theory, but all of them. All of these things that children are doing are helping themselves. They're doing these things to learn, to practice their cognitive skills, which makes all of these things kind of essential when you get right down to it, because it's their job to learn and to grow, and they're doing it by kind of stretching their mind in every way that they possibly can. And so if they're not allowed to do play, if they're not allowed to do make-believe, if they're not allowed to talk to themselves, they have these drawbacks that they're going to have because their mind isn't being stretched in the way that it needs to be. And you'll notice this is kind of a running theme throughout the whole thing, and I'll talk about it again in a second. So you take that idea and then combine it with the fact that between 4 and 7, they start to not want to believe in fairies and ghosts and goblins anymore because they're coming up with more rational explanations. They're testing these cognitive capacities. So, with that in mind, what do you think happens to a child if they're 5 years old, the child doubts Santa Claus, but the parent insists Santa is real, usually because they think that the child's stupidity is cute. They call it innocence, but it's stupidity. They're keeping the child naive and uninformed, and they happen to think it's adorable. So they will continue to tell the child about Santa Claus. Um, this was going to be the topic I had today, but since it's going to get into religion, I decided it's probably best just for a question to ask yourselves. What sort of effect will this have on the child who's struggling to tell the difference between fantasy and reality, and the parent keeps insisting that something that can't possibly be true is? I mean, the idea of a Santa Claus breaks every rule of reality the child has learned so far. And yet the parent is insisting. Would this hold the child back? Would they have to learn to make exceptions? Um, it is they're keeping magical thinking. Now take the same child, and now you're telling him that a religion is there. And it doesn't matter what religion you're talking about here. I'm not bashing Christianity or bashing anything. I'm just saying, what are the effects that we have on these? A lot of psychologists, for example, believe that religion shouldn't be taught to children. It should be because they cognitively just can't understand it yet, and it could possibly limit their cognitive development. And once they get to a particular age, I mean, they could see it. You wouldn't hide it from the children, but they would kind of make that choice later on instead of being, forced into a particular religion. Um, and they do it because of how they're tackling this particular moral question. What you should do when the child is struggling to understand the difference between fantasy and reality and trying to understand the laws of the universe. So it's just kind of an interesting question to pose for yourself as to, what sort of effects you think that would have. Now, the last thing that I want to cover here, I'm going to cover something that we're not going to cover. I'll do the forget about it section here, the don't worry about it, and that is autism. And I'm not going to do autism for a very good reason. The word is vague. There are certain words that we use in the English language, and for those of you getting into nursing or social work or police work or anything like that, I want you to really think about these words and think about how useless they are due to overuse. The fact that we have so many definitions for it. Abuse. Abuse is one of these words. And don't get me wrong, there's abuse out there where, let's say you take domestic abuse, where, a man is punching his wife repeatedly in the face until she's black and blue, and that is abuse. But on the other hand, the husband will criticize the wife, and now she feels she's being emotionally abused or mentally abused, which is a completely subjective experience, and therefore just as prone to be her own sensitivity as the guy's harsh words. It makes using the same term, abuse, for both of these instances makes the term almost useless in any definitive way. Abuse is like this. The word rape is a loaded word. We don't really get into rape much here. I do in some of my other classes, kind of because I'm a social psychologist, so the social nature of it and whatnot. But it's another example where a forced, violent crime has literally the exact same word of two people having sex. Neither one of them said no, but one of them didn't like it. That is also considered rape, and culturally kind of put in that same category. Even though it's an entirely different crime, I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing. I'm just saying the word itself becomes useless when we use it for too many things. And frankly, autism is one of those as well. There are so many different brands of autism that and such a variety of autistic individuals that there's a big difference between the people who are labeled autism, where 10 years ago they would have been called ADD because that was just the fad at the time, and autism is now the up and coming thing, and people who have very severe physical crippling illnesses, and then a whole host of people in between, and some people that are nowhere near that continuum. Um, so we're not going to get into autism at any point in the semester. If you study autism, you'll wind up taking an abnormal psych class, and they'll cover it there. See if there's anything else we need to miss. No, that's the only thing we need to miss. Like I said, with the small amount of material that we have here to go over a chapter in 2 days, we can go ahead and not skip a lot of material anymore. So I was mentioning that everything that the child does is there to kind of boost their cognitive capacity. It's kind of like working out mentally for the child. And so they'll naturally be drawn to these things. And there's on page 133, I know this was in chapter 5, I believe, not chapter 7 like we're working on now, but there's an interesting graph. And what it shows is the line on the bottom is the intelligence score of children. And while it's true that intelligence scores of children are kind of iffy, they're still very reliable. You can't damn a child for a low intelligence score, but you can find general trends when you're testing thousands of children, which is what they did here. And they found that for poor families, they do fine up until about the age of 2, and then they plummet until they get to about the age of 5, and then they go up a lot more. So the natural indication is to think, what's different at this point? Well, they're old enough so that they don't have completely egocentric thinking anymore. They can start to see outside themselves. They can start to see their social environment. The social environment that they're in is not going to affect their intelligence very much until they pay attention to that social environment. And then once they hit around the age of 5 or 6, now they're in school, so they're not seeing that one small social environment anymore. So it just kind of goes to show how essential that social environment is to the child's cognitive development. Now, it could be a host of things in that social environment that is limiting, and if you look at the chart, you'll see it limits them for the rest of their life. They do make a comeback, but they're always quite low. Keep in mind, 100 is average on an intelligence score, and they don't average much higher than 90. They just never recover from that drawback when they were young. It could be the social environment. It could be that certain things are not encouraged. Maybe the kid is given too much free time. It could be that on that particular chart they showed they had an intervention which kind of nullified that big dip that they never recover from. And if you read, the intervention is basically that they had the kids go to a Head Start program. They went to school early, and that's something that impoverished people don't typically do. They don't send their child to daycare. That's something that more wealthy people do because the wealthy people are kind of forced into it. They feel guilty about it, but it's been shown to really help cognitive development to go into a social environment very, very early. Another thing that is interesting is I was actually reading up on an article just yesterday where my fiance is getting a degree in public health. Doctorate or master's, I forget right now, but she was reading up on statistics of new mothers, and they found a bunch of new mothers that were very, very poor. And keep in mind, when they're finding new mothers, they're probably finding them through Head Start programs or federal assistance programs. These are essentially people on welfare, and who were new mothers. So they're going to tend to be relatively young. And they found, very startling actually, that 25% of the population, and they had several hundred, 25% when they took an IQ test were so low as to be considered mentally retarded. and this was, I think, between 60 and 70, um, which is still, it's very low. Bottom 10% of the population. So they were considered mentally retarded. And another, I think 33% were on the border of mental retardation. They were very, very low. So altogether, it was, I think, between 60 and 75% were either mentally retarded or questionably mentally retarded in this particular demographic. So that could also be having an effect where the mothers simply don't. I'm not necessarily saying they're bad mothers, just that it would hinder the child's development if the mother is more concerned with loving the child than with challenging the child. Again, not that loving the child is bad, but we're talking about the cognitive development here and how you would foster that and build it. Last thing that I want to say, it's nothing new. Just really know the Piaget thing. Page 173 has some really good information on it. Know this stuff really well. How the thing on page 173 relates to Piaget. Everything in this chapter is going to relate to Piaget because he's all about the cognitive development. So if you have any questions, let me know.